All right, hello. Today is Tuesday, November 2nd, 2021. My name is Sonia He, and today I'm interviewing Dr. John Paul Liang for the Houston Asian American Archive with Rice University. Thank you so much for being here today with me, Dr. Liang. To start
Thank
off,
you.
yeah,
Yeah,
to
thank
start
you for
off,
having me.
mhm. To start off, could you kind of talk about when and where were you born?
So I was born on December 8th, 1974. Actually, I was born in São Paulo, Brazil. And it was, I think my parents at the time moved from Taiwan to Brazil in the early 1970s. And, and that's, yeah, so I grew up there for about 10 years.
Okay. So how would you describe the household that you grew up in Brazil? Kind of like environment and the family values that you kind of grew up with.
I had actually a pretty good family not life. We lived with my grandparents as well. So it was the seven of us. I have two brothers, older brothers. It was the seven of us plus a dog, a German Shepherd dog. And so it was actually a very unique experience. I love the Brazilian culture, really friendly people. Went to uh, um, the elementary school there, and then went to a German school, private school, uh, for elementary as well. And so it felt like a very international experience.
Okay. How about the neighborhood that you grew up in? Was it like predominantly Asian, or was it kind of a mix, or like just kind of demographic wise?
Um, it was predominantly Brazilian, although in the city there was a very large Japanese population. And luckily, with my grandparents, especially, they knew how to speak Japanese, so they were able to kind of get around because it was a big culture shock for them going from Taiwan to Brazil. But yeah, there was a pretty large Japanese population there.
Okay. And may I ask why your parents decided to move to Brazil in the
I
1970s?
think there were some. I think one of the major reasons that they wanted to go there is that at the time there was fear of communism as maybe one, and the second one is they felt like the education system at the time was really strict over there, where it was probably, I think even today, I think the kids over there, they study all the time. They really didn't have much of a life, and they wanted something that was a little bit wanted to provide a better life for the kids, and they felt like staying there would have been really stressful, especially going through the education system and the pressures of performing well academically. I think they thought that it would be easier if they moved to another country.
Okay. So what did your parents do? Like, what were their careers?
At the time in Taiwan, my mom actually worked in finance, and for I'm not quite sure which company, but it was a large company. My dad was a pharmacist, and they were actually doing pretty well. And But I think the political and the education fears kind of overrided the economic benefits.
Okay. So did they change careers once they got to Brazil?
Yes, actually, my mom. So my dad actually knew acupuncture, studied, and so when he went to Brazil, he started doing acupuncture. Uh, I'm uncertain exactly why. It may be related to the laws there related to pharmacy. Maybe I'm not quite sure why he switched, but and then my mom just assisted him in the clinic, in seeing patients there.
Okay. And what were some of the values that your parents emphasized in your upbringing? I know you mentioned like education was a very important thing on their mind. Any other values that you can think of?
For sure, integrity, and doing staying humble, doing things the right way, not really sacrificing integrity because of financial gain or career gain. Um, Definitely, they made sure that we needed to do things right.
Hmm. And you also mentioned earlier that you lived with your grandparents as well, because they moved over with you. What was it like living in like such a big household with like 7 people? Do you spend most of your time with your siblings, with your older brothers, with your parents, or with your like grandparents?
Um, it was all the above. We had it was the house that we had. It was 3 stories, so the kids stayed in the third floor. My grandparents lived in the first floor along with the kitchen and living room area, and then my parents were in the second floor. So luckily there was enough separation to give people some breathing room, and but we ate dinners together all the time, and then the kids, we were able to go out, and just it felt safer back then. I don't know why. Where or maybe the parents weren't as worried about crime back then as we are now, everywhere. But we pretty much played outside, and so it was there was plenty of space that could be given to different people.
Yeah. Could you kind of like talk about some of your childhood memories of like playing games, hanging out with the other kids in the neighborhood, maybe, and just kind of talk about your childhood experience living in Brazil?
Yeah, I think it was so I think um definitely it was all it's a soccer country. So as long as you had a little soccer ball, you can go out and play, and various kids would come and we would all play together. I had a couple cousins who lived in the same city, and we kind of grew up together, and that was really nice. We were able to see them every weekend or so, along with some family friends who also had kids similar age, and so it was actually a pretty um, normal. Over the weekends we would uh, we would pretty much relax, but we went to afternoon slash evening school. So during the daytime, we would go to the club. My parents would take us to the gym and club where we would go and play basketball, exercise. And then around after lunch is when we would go to school. And then my mom or my dad would pick us up from school around 5:45, 6 p.m. And then we start the day again.
Mhm. Okay. Um, so I guess you also said that you lived in Brazil for about 10 years before you moved. Did you move directly to the United States after that?
Yes, yes, we
Okay.
did.
And
Um,
where did you move to?
so we moved directly to Houston. My mom has family here, and so it was an easier path for them. I don't know if they consider other places. I know my uncle, who I mentioned, we all grew up, who lived in the same city. They also moved, and but they went to San Francisco. So I'm not quite sure if other cities were considered, but definitely I would assume that having my mom's side of the family here probably influenced a lot of that decision.
Mhm. And so, like, kind of, do you know why they decided to move to the United States and leave Brazil behind? And I guess you mentioned that you have family in Houston, but were there any like career considerations or like any other like education considerations?
No, it was a crime rate in Brazil. At the time, I believe, shortly before we moved is when my dad got basically carjacked, and they wanted his wallet, and whether it was intentional or accidental, they cut his wrist, and therefore, after that is probably when that was kind of the last straw, because prior to that, there were some pickpocketing, things like a little smaller versions of crime. And it became just, they felt like it became too dangerous to raise children.
Mhm. Okay, I'm sorry to hear that. That must have been very traumatic.
Oh, no
Um,
problem. It kind of, at the same time, it kind of helped shape what we are today.
mhm.
But luckily I was very young at the time, so I was probably 9 or so. So they kind of shielded me from seeing all those things. We weren't in the car at the time, and so all we knew was the story, and then the scar that was left after that.
Okay. I'm glad that your dad was okay after that,
Yes,
though.
me too.
Yeah. So what neighborhood in Houston did y'all move to? Do you remember?
We moved in the Memorial area, so it was around Memorial and Derry Ashford, and we rented I remember we leased a house, and stayed there. I believe maybe maybe a few years or so, and then we moved to another house that was in the same neighborhood, and then we stayed there all the way until I graduated from high school.
Okay. Um, would you say there was a big difference in culture between Brazil and the United States? Do you have a hard time adjusting, or did you notice anything really different when you moved?
Um, I don't, in terms of, no, I don't think there was, in terms of friendliness, the people, I don't think there was a big difference. Um, Definitely the weather was a big difference in terms of here being very humid and hot. It just felt like it took some time to adjust. But but aside from that, I think being a little on the younger side, it was easier to to switch from one to the other. Definitely, all the English I learned in Brazil was probably worthless until I actually got here and actually took some ESL courses for a year or two. But then other than that, I think it was a lot easier to adjust.
Okay. And kind of like you kind of mentioned language. I don't really know a whole lot about Brazil, but I know you mentioned that you went to a German school. So was it difficult to learn English, even though you had already learned a little bit in Brazil?
Um, Initially, I think so. It was a little bit of an adjustment, but I really feel like the teachers that I had at the time when I moved here they were all really nice, and very patient with us, and definitely that helped a lot. And I think the kids we were with were also really really friendly. I think kids at that age normally they could be mean, but they actually weren't. They were actually really inviting. They were nice, and I do appreciate that.
That's good. Um, and then like which schools did you go to? Like which schools did you attend in the Houston area? Like middle school and high school?
So I attended elementary school. I attended Nottingham Elementary. Middle school, I attended Spring Forest, and then high school, I attended Stratford. I had a great experiences on all three. I think it was truly something that I value. I have no regrets at all with those all three schools.
Okay. And then you said you stayed in Houston up until you graduated high school, and then you went to college. What college did you attend, and during what year? And what did you study during that time?
Yeah, so I attended Cornell University, and Started in 1993 fall, graduated in 1997. I went in thinking that I would be in civil engineering. And when I got on an orientation for engineering class, I saw they were introducing all sorts of engineering majors. And when it came to civil engineering, they had somebody sitting on top of this bridge, unfinished bridge, and it's ocean all the way on the bottom. And I said, I don't think so. This is not for me at all. So I ended up switching to operations research and industrial engineering.
Okay. And would you say, like, what got you interested in engineering in the first place?
Um, I think part of it is you're influenced by your parents and the, I guess in general, the Asian culture, where if you're not a physician, then you probably should go into engineering. And if you're not an engineer, you probably should go into finance. So so that was probably a consideration, that you felt like you never really considered anything else, because those were the few majors that were always talked about. Um, I definitely did not want to be a physician. Um, and I was interested in finance, but that was not a consideration at the time. I think it was almost like, if you're a boy, you go into engineering, and so it was kind of, I don't think they pressured me, but there was this almost like a understanding, like these are the few options that you can go.
Okay. And then during your time at Cornell, like, were you involved in different clubs or organizations with engineering, or did you try to like branch out a little bit?
I No, I stayed within engineering. I knew I knew that I did not do well in physics, which is also another reason why I moved away from civil engineering. I knew that that wasn't for me. And operations research and industrial engineering involved a lot of finance and computer science, which I think finance was a lot easier for me. But we mostly got, when we went there, we got into these dorms that had, and they divided each dorm into little suites, 6-person suites, where 6 people would live together. And so we did a lot in terms of activities, in terms of staying within that suite or neighboring suites. And so those were the friends that we got pretty close with.
Okay. Um, Thinking back on your time at Cornell, do you remember any like defining moments? I know you mentioned the one that you definitely didn't want to go into civil engineering, but any like defining moment or mentor or experience that made you decide that you wanted to study operations
No, I
for
think
4 years? Yeah.
actually it was one of the neighbors within the suite that I lived with. He was 2 years ahead of me, and he was in operations research. And at the time, I did communicate with him in saying that I really did not want to do civil engineering. But then at the same time, I didn't want to give up a year of schoolwork by transferring somewhere else. And that's where he introduced me to operations research, to kind of look into it. And so in a way, he was almost like a mentor. Uh, Probably without him knowing it, but yeah, it was a mentoring, and that got me kind of interested, because he was basically able to sell me the field.
Okay. And what were some of the challenges that you faced during college?
Um, I I think that the courses were definitely not easy. They very frequently, a lot of the classes were graded based on bell-shaped curve. And one of the professors at the time, even in physics, said, that whether it was true or not, I don't know, but at the time they said that Cornell relies on the physics department to do their dirty work in order to filter out all the bad people. So it created a lot of pressure, because some classes were graded based on a C plus, B minus bell-shaped curve. And so you almost guaranteed a certain number of people would fail classes. So, keeping up, making sure, and you're competing against everybody who's been in the top 10. So it's a little bit different than when we were in high school, where you have a larger population, a general population, and getting top 10 is probably not as difficult versus trying to get to top 50% in a top 10 category school. So I think that was probably the biggest challenge.
Okay. And then what did you do after you graduated?
I worked at Andersen Consulting. It's actually called Accenture now. Andersen Consulting back then had both, was comprised of Andersen as well as Arthur Andersen, the accounting firm. And when I got there, it was right in the middle of when Andersen Consulting and Arthur Andersen were splitting up, and they were having some issues. So that was pretty unique. But I worked there for a year, but I didn't really enjoy it. It was right around Y2K. At the time, they thought that the world was gonna come to an end once they hit 2000, and so we did a lot of Y2K testing. I flew to Cleveland and various parts of the country to do various different projects, but I didn't really enjoy it that much. Unlike some people, I don't know, I took the first job that I could, just because it was nice to be employed. And but I looking back, I don't enjoy traveling that much. I enjoy traveling, but not every weekend. So and so that influenced me in order to kind of settle down somewhere else to make a change.
Okay. And I see in the resume that you sent us that you pursued a Master's of Science in Oriental Medicine starting in 1998. Could you kind of explain the process of deciding to go back to school and get that master's?
Yeah, well, my parents founded that college in 1991, and so when you're growing up, that's the last thing you want to do is do whatever your parents are doing. But when I decided to quit Andersen Consulting, my parents convinced me to come back to Houston, and my dad said, just try one class, see if you like it. If you don't like it, just move on and do something else, and find something else that you want to do. And I took one class, and everything just fit. The whole it almost fit like a glove, where you feel like this is the field that you belong to, and it makes good sense, and everything that you believe in fits. And so that's how I got into it.
Okay. You mentioned that your parents were the ones who founded the American College of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine. Could you kind of describe the process of how they decided to come about and build a university from the ground up, I guess?
I think at the time there were a couple of reasons, I think, that went into that. One was more on the personal side. My dad at the time was having some health issues, and he was the primary caretaker or primary earner for the entire family. And because he had a clinic here too, and he was seeing patients, and at the time the worry was that if something was to happen to him, then you had a wife, two parents, and then three kids to feed, along with the dog. So that became a worry. So they were really thinking about trying to find something where, in the event that something happened to him, that it could still provide. And then I think that the business aspect of it was that that's what he knew most, and he acupuncture was really not not widespread in the United States, and he's good at building things from ground up, and so he felt like he had the interest, the energy to to make something from nothing, and so that's why he decided to kind of develop this field, have a you know have a school, and then go from there.
That's really cool. Um, I guess at the time, were there any other schools in the country or anywhere else that
Yes.
would teach? Okay.
Yes, I think there were a few others. There might have been even been one in Houston, but it was definitely something that was just a very small at the time. It wasn't something that had grown. Accreditation wasn't really, it was really non-existent at the time. And so you kind of have to take it into steps and build it up and get that recognition.
Okay. Yeah. Um, so you mentioned that you experimented with these classes, and everything just kind of clicked. Could you kind of talk about like what kind of classes do you take? What kind of like is there a lot of practical and clinical rotations like a traditional medical school would have? Kind of like what was the process of learning?
Yeah, it was a lot of, so there were some didactic classes. It was a lot of hands-on just because a lot of it, whether it's anatomy where you had to try to identify bones and things like that, or acupuncture classes where you had to practice needling. So there was a lot of hands-on experience. But by far my passion, the one that really fit me was actually physiology, just because acupuncture is not as much, the theory behind it is very philosophical. And so when you talk about the theories behind acupuncture, such as yin and yang, five elements, you're not really doing it from an evidence-based research like Western medicine is. You're talking more about life as we experience from everything that we do. And so that philosophy really made sense for me. And so that's the part that I really fell in love with, and kind of carried it through for the other parts.
Okay. You kind of mentioned like the philosophy of Oriental medicine, and how would you say that that philosophy is different from, I guess, Western medicine or a traditional medical schools?
Well, I think one of the biggest differences is that when you look at Eastern medicine, you're looking at the holistic approach. You're looking at the entire body, where one aspect, one organ can impact other organs, or one, where you have a headache, it can be treated by putting needles on the foot. Whereas Western medicine, it's more compartmentalized, where if you go see a GI doctor, that's all they look at, the GI system. And if you wanna look at the liver system, there's a doctor for that. If you want to look at the kidney, there's a nephrologist. So it's much more compartmentalized. They understand that their organs will impact other organs as well, but you have different doctors that are fully specialized and in charge of those systems. Whereas acupuncture, it's almost like a mix. So you start looking at everything holistically.
Would you say there are like spiritual aspects involved with Oriental medicine and acupuncture? And do you believe in some sort of spiritual or religious belief?
Mm, I don't see it as much. I don't really view it as religious. I think definitely, in terms of spiritual, people could probably make it into a spiritual and utilize that aspect of it. I actually don't, but I've seen people meditating, for example, bringing certain spirituality in various things. I'm much more on the biomedical side of things, so I don't implement that into my practice.
Okay. Um, And how much of your practice would you say is procedural, like actually needling, or versus like the guidance of daily habits and just coaching a patient or someone who comes into your clinic um, about their lifestyle?
I would say it's probably 90% procedural. Unless, we generally try not to ask patients to change their lifestyle, uh, unless we really see some bad habits that are causing such things. But a lot of times what we found is that the patients who come to acupuncture generally have some knowledge about what's healthy for them. If not, they generally are not willing to change. So it doesn't really matter that you're making recommendations about what kind of diet they should have, or what kind of sleeping patterns they should have. I think in theory they all know that. It's whether they want to change or not, I think it's different. But for me, it's a little bit outside my scope of practice. So I don't get as much involved in that unless they ask, or unless I see something that's really big that I think it's important for them to change. So I try to stick with my areas of expertise, and I just do the acupuncture.
Okay, yeah. And what would you say are the biggest challenges you faced getting into Oriental medicine acupuncture?
Um, it used to be acceptance. When I first started in the early 2000s, I think there was this big, um, people were still very uneducated about what acupuncture was. And so there were still, you look at the NIH research studies that used to come out during the early 2000s, and it was basically trying to figure out if acupuncture was better than placebo. Whereas now it kind of progressed, and now they're trying to figure out what the mechanisms of acupuncture is. So they already know that it works, and so they're trying to figure out why. What kind of chemical things, or what kind of things are happening when you insert one needle into the body. So I think definitely the challenge at the time was education. Now a lot of people are much more aware of what acupuncture is. A lot of them have tried it. They know about it. Now it's more related to educating them about what kinds of conditions can acupuncture help, because there's still widespread belief that acupuncture can only help pain management. And so just because of the opioid crisis. And the other thing is trying to uh, bust the myth that acupuncture is painful. That's also another challenge. But other than that, I think it's been pretty smooth.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, because my next question was kind of how do you think Western medicine views acupuncture and traditional Oriental medicine?
It used to be considered as an alternative, where I would frequently talk to patients, and they would say, yeah, my physician is not really supportive of me going to acupuncture, and that was primarily in the early 2000s. I think as we progress, in 2010 and now 2020s, much much more supportive. Frequently the patients would say, I've been referred by physicians, or my physician actually recommended it, or they are supportive of me doing this. They might not know exactly what it is and how it can help, but there's a big shift in mentality about it.
That's really good to hear. Yeah. Um, and what would you say is the view of acupuncture and Oriental medicine on Western medicine?
Uh, I think in terms for me, I feel like it's the same as right arm, left arm, where I think there are many cases that you can only rely on Western medicine. There are certain situations where some functional issues that acupuncture is probably better, and there's probably the bulk of it where combining it is probably the best. So definitely, if there's anything structural, I would say don't come to acupuncture. It's the relief is only going to be only temporary. It's not going to really help that much. But if you go to a Western medical facility and they say we can't find anything wrong with you, chances are that's more of a functional issue, and that's where acupuncture really excels.
Okay, yeah, that definitely, it's like, I feel like that's something that I grew up listening to. My parents, also being Chinese, they mentioned a lot of like trying to combine the two, like Eastern and Western medicine, which is really
Yes, I think it used to be called alternative medicine, and then it became complementary medicine, and now it's integrated medicine.
Yeah, it's such a great thing to see how like it's kind of progressed in the way that it's become more accepted by Western medicine. Um,
Yes,
yeah,
it is. Yeah,
yeah.
very good.
What are your sorry, what are your thoughts on the way that Oriental medicine is portrayed in the media? Like specifically, I'm thinking about popular media recently. How I think Michael Phelps was the person who first brought cupping into like mainstream media, and then I also see now on TikTok a lot of like beauty TikTokers or people use like gua sha on their face to slim their face and all that. What's your view on the way that these techniques or these methods are being portrayed in the media?
Overall, I think it's been okay. You know, I think I read somewhere. I think Angelina Jolie was crediting acupuncture for helping with her Bell's palsy at the time. I think overall, it's been good. You know, you mentioned the swimmers. You see all these cupping circles on bruises on their on their bodies, and that's, I think it's very accurate. The things that are not as accurate is when you start looking at movies and things and you start seeing people's faces with 100 needles in their faces. I think those are very unlikely. It's not a general accurate portrayal of what acupuncture is. Very rarely, for me, very rarely do I exceed more than 10 to 15 needles total for the entire body. So for the face to have 30 needles is just, it doesn't seem very accurate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And do you think that there's like a lack of knowledge of like the theory or like the kind of the cultural basis or the theoretical basis of these different procedures, and it's more just like a kind of you see someone famous doing it and or you see someone know doing it and then you just kind of follow along with the idea? Do you feel like there's a lack of knowledge in like learning the historical roots of Oriental medicine?
Um, yeah, for some people, yes, definitely. Because, well, in the clinic, we do see two types of patients. One is that they won't ask any questions. They just say, you do your thing. I don't care how it works. You just make me feel better. And then there's the other side that they like to ask a lot of questions about how it works. So I think you do have these two types of patient, um, uh, I guess, patient curiosity, and the ones that really don't want to know. I think they have very little knowledge of acupuncture, but it's not just acupuncture. I think they have very little knowledge of medicine in general because they don't that's not their interest. I think their interest is just to feel better. Whereas there are, on the other side, there are some people who want to ask exactly, what are you doing, why, where does this meridian go, and yeah, they definitely have two sides.
That's good. It's kind of interesting to see that there are actually people who are interested in how it works, which
Quite a
is
bit,
really great.
actually. Yeah, yeah. And the funny thing is sometimes is that we will put needles thinking that they don't really care, and then they will ask, "Oh, well, can you explain a little bit about what you're doing?" So,
Mhm. That's good.
yeah.
Um, and you focus a lot on acupuncture. Can you tell me a little bit about the theory behind acupuncture and how it works, I guess?
Yeah, so acupuncture is based on meridian system. There's 12 regular meridians, two extra ones on top of that, and 361 points that are the base points. There's probably another 50 to 70 or so that are extra, what we call extra points. Some of these extra points are agreed on, some are not agreed on. It's more related to experience points. But basically, where people have issues is where you start doing some differential diagnosing. I definitely, the one that people know most is pain management, and quite frequently is, where the pain is, that's where the needle is. But along with that, it's where the pain is where you start targeting some of the meridians that are related to that. Kind of like where I mentioned before, where somebody with migraine headaches, you might not necessarily want to put needles on the head where it's hurting, because sometimes it might increase the pain level. So you wanna target the same meridian that's on the feet, and try to hit those points to be a little bit gentler. So yeah, so definitely acupuncture is based on the meridian system, and but then the diagnosing that we do is quite frequently done by yin and yang theory, as well as the 5-element theory, which is how the organ system actually starts becoming related to each other.
Okay. And do you think acupuncture is like a broad East Asian practice, or like an Asian practice, or is it like a predominantly Chinese one, or like I'm just curious about like the history of acupuncture.
Yeah, I think it started in China, and then but definitely it quickly spread to um, Korea, Japan, Europe. I think Germany has a big focus on acupuncture research. Auricular acupuncture is being credited to the French scientists for discovering auricular acupuncture. And so it's quite widespread, actually.
Okay. And I guess in what ways do you think acupuncture can treat or heal a patient in a way that Western medicine cannot?
I think it's the holistic approach, where, for example, somebody with migraine headaches, that is caused by stress management, and maybe influenced by lack of sleep, or maybe some heart issues, or maybe um, some burnout. You start looking at everything together to develop this diagnosis. Whereas, some maybe Western medicine, they might not look at some of these causes, and they might just treat the migraine headache on its own. So when we start looking at different conditions, you're gonna have a lot of different treatment protocols depending on what you think is the cause of such a problem. And so it's not necessarily the disease that you're treating, you're treating the entire symptom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like been a lot of like awareness recently about, especially with like mental health. I guess there's a lot of focus on finding the underlying causes, and kind of
Yes.
seeing the patient a little bit more holistically. Yeah.
And I think a lot of it also comes from constitution. We're trying to develop a system where everybody can input their health symptoms, and it'll spit out your weakest organ based on Chinese medicine theory. And what that does is it makes you aware of your health, whether you're a 16-year-old person or you're a 90-year-old person. Everybody, I believe, is born with some general weaknesses. No one is strong in every single organ, and that's why I think you have people who claim that they were smokers for 40 years and they never had lung cancer, but then somebody who has secondhand smoke for a short period of time also already has lung cancer. So you constantly see that, and I think a lot of it depends on what you're born with in terms of what your constitution is, and then influenced by what you eat and your lifestyle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess kind of moving a little bit into like the business side of running a clinic in the college. What is your patient demographic? Like, what kinds of patients do you see? What ethnicity are they generally? And like, why do they usually come in?
We see a pretty diverse background. I would guess probably it'll be a third to maybe 40 to 50% is Caucasian. We have a large Hispanic patient population as well. And then ironically, we have a smaller Asian population, but I think a lot of the Asian population will go to Chinatown to get treatments, and we're not located there. So I think that's one of the reasons why. But yeah, but we're also inside every single Houston Methodist Hospital. And so as part of their wellness services department. And so you see a lot more healthcare people there just because it's wellness and their employees are right there. But definitely 40 to 60-year-old, primarily females. But the ethnicity generally is very diversified.
That's really interesting to hear. Yeah, I'm surprised that not as many people of Asian descent would be coming to see
Yeah.
you, but yeah, it would make sense that they go to Chinatown.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's the major reason. Yeah.
Yeah. And how has like COVID-19 affected your field and your practice in general?
Oh, definitely. You know, the first time in 2020 when it first hit, you know, half of our patient population disappeared, and I think rightly so, in that people were afraid of COVID, and at the time we really didn't know much about it, and therefore it was difficult to have a protocol set where we could protect everybody. But as time progressed and we quickly started having these protocols where every single practitioner would wear gloves and masks, and so we limited the amount of inquiry that we needed, just because at the time we didn't want to have people talking or spending too much time inside the rooms, and a lot less touching in terms of assessments, where we're just trying to limit the amount of exposure that everybody had. Now, definitely the protocol is much more solid. Knock on wood, we never had a COVID issue with the patients, but you know, eventually that will change. I think somebody is bound to get it. I think COVID is just that powerful. But you know, at this point, I think definitely patients are starting to come back because, you know, it's been 2 years. They are starting to realize that it's probably not going to go away, and they need to go back to their semi-relatively normal lifestyle where they take care of their own health and not hide in their houses forever. But the other big major change that we've seen is that rather than pain management being the #1 condition we treat, it's actually now mental health. Anxiety, depression, stress, by far is #1.
Okay, yeah. Would you say that the reason why there's been increase in mental health patients as a direct result of COVID and the isolation, social isolation? Would you say?
Yeah, I think so, by far. You know, people are the stress of just being worried about COVID, and then on top of that, you're stuck at home. You're not really going out. You're not interacting with people. And then you have additionally, you know, family members that are in close proximity with each other. That probably is sometimes not the best thing. So all of it combined for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And kind of in relation to COVID-19, what have been the biggest challenges in your personal life with regards to COVID-19 and the pandemic?
You know, you can't go out. You know, of course, I think some people are okay with doing various things, but I haven't been inside a restaurant for about 2 years, just because there's still fear of being in an enclosed environment with the masks off and people are talking. So definitely that has been the biggest challenge, where we used to go to restaurants, we used to go watch shows. We haven't done any of that for about 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Even though it feels like some things are kind of returning to normal, there's still with the recent Delta variant, and then also just people not getting vaccinated, there's a lot of risks still out there.
Yeah, and I think it depends on your how you view this COVID. You know, we have half the population that don't think it's as big of a deal. And so they are okay with not wearing masks. Once they get vaccinated, they're fine. They're walking around. They'll go into different places, restaurants. And then you have other people where they're very scared, regardless if they get vaccinated or not. Um, for us, we are kind of more towards the timid part, just because in healthcare I see things, but luckily we're not at a point where we are completely isolated in our house and we can't live our lives, because I think at some point we have to start relaxing some of our fears, or else it will consume you, because at some point in time you're trying to balance between safety and sanity, and at some point you have to start doing things.
Yeah, that's definitely true. What are your hopes for? I guess you kind of mentioned earlier that you think COVID is going to be kind of a permanent thing, or it's going to be. Would you say it's something like the flu, that you would have to get a vaccine every year, uh, like a booster
Yeah,
or something?
I mean, for me, I think for me and my family, we've always had flu vaccines, um, and uh, and I'm a proponent of COVID vaccines as well, just because of the things that we hear and we see and how nasty this virus is. Um, but I think at the same time is that people need to make decisions based on their own family issue. You know, everybody has very strong feelings about various things. I and I completely understand a lot of where different individuals come from. Um, but I think if people get vaccinated, hopefully, you know, that you don't have to throw the dice as much. You know, instead of throwing instead of having a larger risk, hopefully you make it a little bit smaller. And yeah, so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, and would you mind sharing some of your thoughts on like the rise of anti-Asian sentiment with the COVID-19 pandemic?
Fortunately, I haven't experienced it myself. Yeah, everyone I interacted with, whether it's patients or colleagues or public members, have been really great and really nice to me. But when you start reading the internet and you start seeing things, you do have that kind of fear that there will be, or there are some anti-Asian sentiments going on. Uh, but hopefully, you know, luckily I it's difficult for me to comment, just because I haven't experienced it myself, luckily so far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess, do you think that this kind of sentiment will affect the way that acupuncture and oriental medicine, like its trajectory in the future? Because I know there's been some negative media about um, like Chinese medicine or oriental medicine because of the pandemic as well.
No, I mean, I think right now, if you look at the patient volume, it is increasing. I think at the end, when people are desperate to get help, they would try anything. And if they feel like acupuncture can help, they will go to do acupuncture. So I have not noticed that because of their political views, they refuse to go to acupuncture to receive healthcare. Um, I think how acupuncture in general has been widespread enough in the United States for many decades, to the point that people are already integrating it into their healthcare system. And you have enough practitioners and public members who've done acupuncture before who are vouching for it. So I don't think acupuncture can ever go back to what it used to be, where it's very isolated. I think at the end, it's effective enough that people are willing to, if it means that they will get them better, they are willing to do it, just because it will make them feel better. And they might try other things initially, but it's no different than 30 years ago when people would try everything else and we used to be the last line of defense. So I don't think there's any difference. It's just that nowadays people would come to us as a first line of defense rather than last, but we're used to always being the last line of defense.
Mhm. That's good. That's good to hear that. It hopefully won't revert back to just kind of being isolated.
At least not yet. We have not seen anything like that yet.
Yeah, yeah. And then kind of about your involvement. You are the president, correct me if I'm wrong, the president of the American College of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine. And then you're also involved in a couple other organizations nationally in Houston. Could you kind of talk about your community involvement?
Yeah, so I've been involved in, as in from the state in associations, and then in the past in the accrediting agency overseeing acupuncture programs in the United States. I think it's important for me because I get to see all a different perspective. I get to see it from a national, from a statewide point of view, where you see it more on a global side of things rather than just being stuck in a local region, and you start seeing more what is the trends, what is the industry trend, and what are people's views, and where is this medicine going. I think it would be difficult for me to see that acupuncture is going towards an integrative approach if I was always stuck in a more clinical, Houston only type mentality. And so being in a community where it's a national community or state community, you really see that there's a wide range of opinions and they all make sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I also see that you got um, many degrees in education, a master's of science in education, and then a doctor of philosophy in education. What prompted you to study education?
It was mostly because I've been in administration, and it was something that it was required in terms of trying to manage an education institution. So a lot of the things related to education I didn't understand at the time when I first got on board, and it was really valuable to start learning what the accrediting agency is looking for in terms of why are they requiring this, or how do we make students more successful. I think that is something that was really valuable for me to get that degree, because it really made me understand how to structure things, how to lead an institution, maybe what kind of curriculum should we move towards, and making students more successful. I think that they taught me all that.
That's good. Yeah, definitely being in charge of an educational institution has its own unique set of challenges.
It does. It does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. And then just a couple final questions on your identity. How would you identify yourself?
In terms of
Ethnicity, like Asian American, or some people would like to identify themselves like by their career. So how would you, if you were to introduce yourself, identify yourself?
I think I identify as Asian American. I think, I think having being out of the Asian countries, outside of that my whole life, it makes it difficult for me to be able to accurately identify myself as Chinese or Taiwanese or something like, because I never really experienced it firsthand. And so I think when you start living outside, and if you're born outside of the Asian countries, it's almost like a blend. You don't really have that identity where you know for sure that this is Chinese culture. I think a lot of it's kind of like the fortune cookie thing, and where you later find out, oh, actually that's not really Asian. And so I think when you start living outside of the Asian countries, you have your own culture, and sometimes it's a mix of many different Asian cultures. So I would identify myself as Asian American.
Okay, yeah. And do you have any stories or instances where you remember struggling with like identifying as Asian American or having that kind of struggle of um, maybe not being as immersed or being as connected with, say, your cultural heritage in growing up in Brazil and the United States, and then those struggles maybe like while you were younger in school or at any other point in time?
Yeah, I think it's when you're living, especially back then in the late 70s, early 80s, you do have and you're living in an outside country, you do experience some racism. Kind of I mentioned before that there's a large Japanese population in Brazil. We as kids we would automatically be called Japanese, whether you're Japanese or not. It didn't matter. You're just called Japanese. So you do experience some of that. You do. I did experience some a little bit here when I moved here, and whether and I don't know. It's just kids being mean or so you do have these types of experiences where you start wondering, why you're Asian sometimes and why are you different from other people. But just like I think as you start growing up, you start remembering, what the strengths are in being Asian, and the racism starts to hopefully decline a little bit as people also start to become more mature too. So yeah, so were the challenges that I faced.
Mhm. Yeah. And I guess, what is your hope for the Asian American community within Houston? It's like trajectory in the future, and then kind of how the Asian American community in the United States will progress in the future. Kind of what are your hopes, and how do you see the demographics changing?
I, I always hope that Asians actually are more unified. I don't know, when you start comparing Asians with other cultures, sometimes Asians are more fragmented. They're not. You see when you start voting for president or for whatever politics, there's a reason why Asians are rarely the focus of conversations. Not just because we are 3% or 5% of the overall population, but I think in addition to that, we are a little bit more fragmented in general. That there is no point in focusing. There's no motivation to focus on Asians because at the end, Asians are going to cancel each other out anyways. So I think definitely there has been an effort that I know of, with 80/20 and all these other Asian organizations trying to unify. And so what I hope to see in the future is that we can have a more unified voice uh, and and be able to sometimes sacrifice our own points of view so that we can have that unified voice. And so yeah, that's what I hope for.
Yeah, that's definitely something I see a lot. There's a lot of like division within ethnic groups, and then also between ethnic groups. And I feel like that's something that definitely works against Asian Americans in the U.S., especially on the political scene. Yeah.
It does. I mean, it's almost like even when you start looking at the Chinese culture, we even subdivide that. Are you Cantonese? Are you Taiwanese? Are you? And so you have so many different divisions, and you're trying to fragment everything. So, but very rarely do I hear people just say I'm Asian.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. And then I guess closing out with one final question: what is kind of your advice for future generations of Asian Americans, future generations of people interested in acupuncture or Oriental medicine? Just kind of what is the message you want to leave
Um, Definitely, I think it's Asians tend to focus so much on academics and the pressures that Asians face. As definitely now that I'm 46, um, I sometimes feel like I think people need to enjoy the process, enjoy, you do want to strive, but it's not working 20 hours a day doesn't make you better. It working so hard on work for work, it doesn't make you, it doesn't mean that you're successful. I think now that I have my own family and I think it's definitely, we wanna work hard, but then we also want to enjoy the process because time will fly by really quick. And that's what I'm trying to do now, where I don't want to look back. Every time, when you start talking to the elderly, my patients who are older, very rarely do they say that they have regrets about working more. They every single time they have regrets, it's about family, it's about personal people. So definitely I would recommend that you strive to be the best, but at the same time you allocate some time and effort for people, for your own family members, so that you have no regrets in the future.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a very good message. That I hope people who watch this interview later on will hopefully resonate. It will resonate with them. And I guess you mentioned your family. I was wondering, could you talk a little bit more about your own family now?
Yeah, I have two girls, a wife and two girls, and definitely it's something that I will not change for anything. It's I grew up with just boys, so it's definitely a learning curve. But I've always wanted daughters, and they're a lot of fun, and it's something that I think makes life much more interesting. So yeah, they keep me out of work sometimes, which I think it's a necessity.
Mhm. Yeah. And do you mind me asking, how did you meet your wife?
Well, so I actually met her online. When I was in school, it was at the time it was really difficult to meet anybody, and so somebody, I can't recall who it was, but somebody actually recommended to go online, and at the time I thought, oh my goodness, am I going to find somebody who's psychotic? Little did I know she was thinking the same thing, but but at the end it worked out. So yeah, so
Yeah,
it's
that's really
definitely,
nice to hear.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Online dating before like apps like Tinder, I guess became really a big thing.
Yeah, I don't know much about Tinder. We actually did eHarmony at the
Mhm.
time, and I did that just because it seemed like they did a lot more research. They asked a lot of questions about personalities and things like that. Um, but but it turned out that we actually, our families knew the same people, and that really enforced it. So uh, I think what made it sustainable, I think, was the fact that we had that personal connection. People knew people who had mutual friends, mutual acquaintances, and that really, I think, made the difference.
Yeah, that's really nice to hear. Thank you so much for sharing your life story and your experience living in Brazil and the US, and then all of your experiences in acupuncture. Thank you so much.
Thank
Um,
you. No, thank you for having me. It was enjoyable.
yeah, and let me know if you have any questions, and I'll stop the recording.